This baby was born worth $10 billion, but when the nurse washed him, she found that the baby was not breathing. The nurse was afraid that the baby's rich father would blame her, so she rushed to call the doctor. Unexpectedly, the rich man's butler was holding the phone. She had no choice but to tell him what happened, but as soon as the nurse dialed the phone, the butler cut her off. It turns out, the butler's wife had just given birth to a baby. In order to repay the rich man's favor, he was willing to use his newborn son to replace the dead baby. Before the nurse could wake up from her surprise, the butler had already brought his own son to the hospital room and swapped the two babies, but as soon as they stepped out of the ward, the sky suddenly flashed with lightning and thunder. The baby in his arms miraculously survived. The nurse was so happy that she wanted to switch back, but the housekeeper grabbed the baby, warned her not to ruin his good deed. It turned out that the butler was not trying to repay the rich man's favor. He wanted his son to become a member of the rich family, to inherit the billionaire's fortune. He's been poor all his life. How could he let go of such a good opportunity? But the nurse didn't want him to succeed, wanted to take back the baby, but the butler pushed her off a building and left her in a vegetative state. The tycoon didn't know anything about it. They left the hospital in a luxury car with the baby in their arms. At the same time, the butler also took away the tycoon's son in a tricycle. Thus the fate of the two babies changed forever. The tycoon gave his son a noble name, William, and the butler named his son Jack. After all, it was someone else's child. He didn't waste his time with names. He would spend his spare time at work to spend time with his own son, William, and when he saw William get a 9 on his test, he'd change it to a perfect score so that his own son would be loved by the rich family. But when Jack got a perfect score, instead of rewarding him, the butler taught Jack that studying hard wouldn't change his fate. Ever since he was a child, the butler never bought Jack any new clothes. He never changed his toothbrush even when it was out of bristles, and he scolded Jack all the time. And what's worse, Jack worked hard to get into a prestigious school. The housekeeper went to the school without saying a word, forced him to withdraw from the school. When he found out that his own son, William, had returned from abroad, he asked Jack to go all the way to buy a pumpkin, because he'd heard that pumpkins could ward off bad luck. When Jack arrived at the mansion, he suddenly felt a special kind of closeness, but his father, who was watching, said to him, "You want to live in a house? You are dreaming." Jack couldn't figure it out. His father was kind to everyone, but he treated him like a slave. Jack wanted to change his father's opinion of him, decided to improve himself. He prepared his resume and went to a public company for an interview. Jack's ability and humor got him through the interview in no time, but the next day at work, a pair of white legs caught his eye. A man's first day on the job, he's attracted to a pair of white legs. His eyes were about to leave their sockets, until the woman walks into the elevator. He was still staring at her. The woman was uncomfortable with the stares. She tried to say something to divert the man's attention, but it didn't work. The man was still staring at her legs, and the hairs on his head stood out. The woman was speechless. When the elevator door opened, she hurried out. Until then, the man realized that he was out of line, but when he got to the office, he realized the woman was her boss, Kathy. In order to punish Jack for his flirtatious behavior towards her, she assigned him to work in the hot desert. Jack called her to complain. Kathy transferred him to the frigid North Pole. Luckily, he persevered, and he finally got the approval of his boss, Kathy, and the two of them fell in love with each other. That day, Casey took Jack out to discuss business. The other party was a tough guy with a mob background. He wanted to buy his company at a low price. Casey was too scared to refuse, but Jack stepped forward at that moment. The other party immediately called in their thugs, but the next moment, Jack took care of them in a flash. He was so scared that he didn't dare to say a word. The rich man saw the scene. He admired Jack's decisiveness in business. Looks like himself when he was young, and then he looked at his son, William, facing the same strong business partners. He didn't even have the courage to fight back. He didn't realize that Jack was his own son, and that William was an imposter. All of this, it was the butler's idea. In order to find a good helper for his son William, the tycoon decided to use his power to get Kathy to marry William, so that Jack could work for him. But Kathy only had eyes for Jack. They decided to go to the tycoon for a showdown, but when they arrived at the office, they found the tycoon on the floor, badly injured. It turns out that just a few minutes ago, the mobster was competing with the tycoon for business, stabbed him in the chest with an umbrella, and broke the elevator, and locked the door behind him. He wanted the tycoon to die without medical attention, but Jack was smart enough to use. He used the janitor's basket to get to the first floor. The gangster who just came out of the building was not happy to see them. Jack took the tycoon to the hospital. At that moment, a patient passed by him. He was the nurse who was pushed off the building by the butler because of years of paralysis. She couldn't speak, but when she recognized Tycoon, she was so excited that she spoke. She asked Jack if he was the tycoon's son. Jack refused, pointing to the butler who was on his way. He said, "That's my father." The nurse became agitated and told Jack the truth. The butler had exchanged him for his own son. Jack's real father was not the butler. It was the rich man in the hospital. The nurse's years of grief were finally over. She died peacefully on the spot. Jack couldn't believe it, remembering how the butler treated him like a slave. Then he realized he was not his own. In front of the operating room, Jack couldn't speak for a long time. This was his father. This is his original family. Because of the butler's greed, everything that belonged to him was taken away. But the butler was always yammering on. Rich people are a pain in the ass, and they make a big deal out of minor injuries. Jack couldn't stand it any longer.